Invalid configuration object, Webpack unable to locate index.html glob. So multiple assets emits different content to the same file index.html. Looking at some of the tutorials which do not really work. This is so sad. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. I'm CodeWithAhsan, and in this video you're gonna learn TypeScript, Webpack, and Tailwind CSS basic project even without any frameworks. So sometimes you want to work on just simple stuff that you want to get started with, but you also want the goodness of TypeScript and Tailwind, but also keeping, the classes, the OOP and whatnot. So this is what you're going to learn in this video. I was working on my stream and I wanted to do the same, and it took me a lot of time to figure all of this out because none of the tutorials, whether on videos or articles, are actually up to date with Webpack 5. So in this video, you're gonna learn it all. I know that a lot of you people watch the video but don't subscribe to the channel. If you want this channel to grow and help out other devs, like hundreds of devs in the world, please make sure to subscribe and share this video among other selves as well. And without further ado, let's get started. So I'm gonna just open it by doing code and then TypeScript Tailwind Webpack starter. So this should open into VS Code and we can continue from there. So in this, I'm going to just open my terminal, and in the terminal, I'm going to start working on creating this project. So first of all, we need to run npm init-y. This essentially creates our package.json file with the basic defaults, so we can easily work on those. I'm also going to just remove this main from here and also just add a private to true because we are not going to publish this at all anywhere. So I'm going to just make this true. Now that we have this, let's also mention that this is an MIT licensed, and now we are going to get started. The first thing that we want to do is to install Webpack and TypeScript so we can get started with installing those. We'll do npm install --save dev, and then we are going to say ts loader and then Webpack and Webpack CLI, and we are also going to install TypeScript. So let's save this. Now once this is installed, we should have a node modules folder created within here. So we are installing the node packages. We don't have to commit this to our GitHub repository. So we are going to just create a new file called gitignore, and then we are going to do git init. So we can say git init here, and then we can just add the node modules folder to this gitignore file. So we can say node modules, and now you see that this is grayed out. So we are good at this moment. We're just going to continue with some of the configurations. So now that we have the Webpack CLI and Webpack installed, also the ts loader and TypeScript, let's see how we can configure this really quick. So first of all, we need to add two scripts to our package.json, one for the dev mode and one for production. So we are going to add these two commands. Look at the start command. It says Webpack serve. So we are using the Webpack CLI command Webpack, and we are using the serve command to essentially spin up the server, that web development server. Then we are saying that, hey, we are going to be using this build command to generate the production build. And now we have to provide the configuration of what JavaScript or TypeScript file we would be using and where would they be deployed to, or where would they end up in the build process. So first of all, since this is going to be a TypeScript project, we do need to create a source folder, and we also need to create a tsconfig.json file. So we are going to say tsconfig.json, and this is essentially the file which TypeScript compiler uses to generate files. So here you see that we have some compiler options. So we are going to generate the final bundle into the dist folder. We are enabling the source map, which means that we should be able to debug this really well into Chrome DevTools or other DevTools. Similarly, we have other targets here as well. We don't need to go through all of those. Now we are also going to create another file called webpack.config.js, and this is going to be the configuration file for Webpack, which will do a lot of things that we are going to go through in this tutorial. So the webpack.config file is going to have this configuration. Notice what we are doing here. First of all, we are using path names, but essentially this has an entry point. So we should have the index.ts inside the source folder, which is going to be the entry point of Webpack. Webpack requires an entry point where all of the other files are going to be imported. So this should essentially import all of the other files, and then Webpack analyzes those dependencies and then finally bundles them into one file. Secondly, we are using the mode development. Then we have some rules for any file which is a tsx file or even a ts file. We are using the TypeScript loader. This is a package that we installed in the first step, and you can see that we are excluding the node module, so we are not looking into any other ts file. Finally, you can see that extensions that we are going to work with are going to be tsx, ts, and js, and the output of all all this bundling would be inside the dist folder and the file name would be bundle.js. So what we are going to do here is we are just going to go ahead and create index.txt file. So we can say something like index.ts, and here we can have some sort of function. So here we could say something like const main equals, and then here we can say console.log. We can say CodeWithAhsan here and hello world. Now I just need to call this function. So what I'm going to do is call this, and now we are going to bundle this. So to bundle this, we just need to run npm run build, and this should essentially generate this file into the dist folder as we discussed. So now you see that we got the dist folder and we also got the bundle.js file. So the bundle.js file contains JavaScript file that is transpiled from TypeScript, and you can see that we have all of the code right here. Now let's talk about this being a web application. So we definitely need an index.html that we can serve into the browser. So what we can do here is that we can create an index.html inside the dist folder. So we are going to create this file here. We're going to use mad quickly create HTML file. I'm going to quickly format this now, and all we need to do right now is just to use a script tag that uses this bundle.js. So I'm going to just create a script tag here. So I'm going to say script and source, and here we can give this the bundle.js, and now we can serve this file into our browser. So if we run this Webpack serve, or even if we run npm start, that's going to do the same thing. So if you do npm start, let's see what happens. So essentially, as you can see, it says npm install Webpack dev server. Now this is important. We have not set a dev server so far, but we can definitely open this even into Chrome without even having the dev server. So if I just double click this file, the index.js, and if I go to inspect, you will see that in the console, we are going to see the log that we put there. So we are essentially compiling the file. But the fun part here is that you can see that since we generated this with TypeScript, and inside the tsconfig.json, we have the source map set to true. That's how you can see that it says index.ts, even though the file that we are including in our head, or actually in the body, is bundle.js. So even from the bundle, it is able to identify what is the source of this file. And I can open it, I can actually debug this, refresh this, and you can see that we are easily able to debug even the TypeScript file whenever we are working with that. So that makes the process much easier. Now that we have tried to run it, actually, let's install the dev server. Now that we have checked this, we can now install the dev server to essentially use it in the proper way. So we are going to essentially install two things. We are going to install the HTML Webpack plugin and the Webpack dev server. The reason for that is right now we have everything inside this dist folder, and the HTML still remains the same, but the JavaScript file that keeps bundling every time. And if we try to commit our code to GitHub, then every time we change some code, the dist folder also would have this bundle being pushed to that, which is probably not a really good idea. So we are going to use the HTML Webpack plugin to generate this HTML dynamically instead of having that inside the dist folder. But first, let's try using the dev server. So now that we have the package installed, which is the Webpack dev server, all we need to do is to go to our Webpack config here, and then here inside we just add this dev server object, and we need to specify this static property which tells the server or the dev server where to serve the files from. So we are serving everything from dist now. So if we run the npm start now that we have checked the application, we can install the Webpack dev server to do things properly. In order to do so, we can just run npm install --safe dev, and here we use two things: HTML Webpack plugin and Webpack dev server. And this Webpack dev server essentially requires one property to be added into the Webpack config.js, which is essentially this: the dev server object is required for this dev server, and we also need to specify where to serve the files from. Since we have our index.html inside the dist folder, our source only has the index.ts. We are using a static dist. And now if we run first, if we save this and if we run the npm start command again, we should be able to now use the server out of the box. And there you go. You can see that once we run this, we can open it and we can see the log as well. And this would also make sure whenever we've changed something into our code, this would also refresh it. So if something changes, for instance, if I go ahead and change something like hello world 123, you will see that our bundle is created again, which means the bundle.js updates, and you will see that the app runs again as well. So here now you see the hello world 123. So this is also enabling the live reload for us as we are using the dev server. Now the only problem with this is that, as I said, this bundle.js actually is generated every time. So we don't want this dist to be part of the repository, because we would have to push everything whenever we have a difference in the build process, and we might not even be building anything, and that could also be a problem. So what we need to do is that instead of using this in dist, we need to use the same file inside the source, but we should be able to then copy it inside the dist folder. So we are going to do something like that. So first we are going to move this into the source folder. This bundle.js remains the same, everything remains the same, but we have moved this into source folder. Now we are going to use a package called copy webpack plugin. So we need to do npm install -save copy webpack plugin, and we are going to configure our webpack config to copy the index.html from source to dist. Now this is something that is not required for development server, but this is going to be used for the build process for sure. So we are going to go to our plugins, or actually we don't have the plugins array. So we are going to use the plugins array, and here we are going to add this copy webpack plugin. So we need to just copy this, and now we are also going to import this. So we can say const copy webpack or copy plugin equals require, and here we can say copy webpack plugin. Now notice this, that the copy plugin, and we are specifying the pattern by saying source/index.html to index.html. We don't need to specify the dist folder here because the output already goes inside the dist folder. So we don't need to specify that. Now if we run this, and what I'm going to also add here is I'm going to add the clean to true, which means that whenever we save the file or we have a change or we build this production bundle, this dist folder is going to be cleaned first, and then we are going to also copy this file. So now if I run npm run build, let's see what happens. We should be copying this index.html to the dist folder. As you can see here, we just copied it, and it contains the bundle.js, and also everything works fine. So if I delete dist folder, and if I just go ahead and run npm start, which is essentially running the dev server, what would happen? Would it still require the dist folder? So if I inspect this now, you will see that it still works without requiring the dist folder. So if I go ahead and see here, we don't have the dist folder. It is only required for build process or for production build. Now that we have this, there is one problem, and that is if I go ahead into my index.html, and here, let's say if I wanted to add a heading here that also says CodeWithAhsan, what would happen? If I save this file, you will see that it says compiled successfully, and if I go here, I don't see any changes. You see that, but now you see that once I've refreshed it, I see the changes. So that means that it is not changing anything or reloading when we change the HTML. So if I go ahead and let's say if I remove this, save this, you see that there's no reload, it says nothing changed. But if I refresh, then I can see the changes. So this is a problem. How do we solve this? Right now in the Webpack config, we have this dev server which is only looking at static. Instead of looking at the static, we should be looking at the source folder and all the files inside. So to exactly tell Webpack about this, we can use this watch files, and we just provide the source folder, and that means now it's going to watch everything inside the source folder. So we should be able to see all the changes whenever we change a file. So let's see, and let's have this reloaded. Now you see that we have the title here. If I go ahead into my HTML and remove the title, let's say code with, you see that it automatically reloaded. We didn't have to even refresh the page. Save, and you see that it is automatically reloading. So that's good. Now let's talk about CSS in this whole setup. Right now you see that we only have the index.ts. We are not using any CSS so far. So what happens if I want to have some CSS installed? So let's say we have this index.css file, and inside that we have a style that says body, background color, blue violet. So if we do that, it is not going to be applied until we import the CSS, but there could be multiple CSS files, and they could also import other CSS files as well. So what we can do is we can use a loader from Webpack that essentially allows us to just import our CSS files into our JavaScript or TS files, just like you would do in React or other frameworks as well. So how do we do that? We start by installing some packages, and the packages are essentially these ones. We do npm install -save dev, CSS loader, and style loader. So we are just going to install those, and then we should be easily able to do something like this. So we do import, then we say index.css. Now the thing is that if I just do this, and if I run my server, let's see what happens. So we're gonna go to our webpack.config.js, and here we need to add another rule. Just like we have a rule for all TypeScript files to use this TS loader, we have to have a rule for CSS files to use relevant loaders. We're just gonna add this rule real quick, and if you look at that, it says all the CSS files should essentially use the style loader and the CSS loader inside the source folder. So inside the source folder, we have this file. So I think we should be good, and we should be able to install these. So now if I run this again, let's see what happens. So now you see that we actually got this running without any errors, and now our CSS is actually being included from this TypeScript import. So this is working. Awesome. Now the final thing that we need to do is to install Tailwind Tailwind CSS into this starter so we can use it in our project. Now, before we do that, we might just want to, let's say, refactor a bit. So let's say there's a styles folder inside and we have index.css inside that. And we also need to then update this source as well. So we can say styles and index.css. This should be fixed now. Now, finally, what we need to do is to install some more loaders for Tailwind. Now, Tailwind requires some additional tools. For instance, we can use post CSS with Webpack in this project to use Tailwind CSS. So let's install some packages first. So we are going to install the post CSS loader, post CSS preset, env, and Tailwind CSS all together into our project. And then we are going to configure the Webpack config for this. So we are going to install all these packages, which is post CSS loader, post CSS preset, env, and Tailwind CSS from the npm repository. And once these are installed, we are going to configure our Webpack config.js. So let's go to our Webpack config. And one more thing that we need to do is we need to define here that we are going to use the post CSS loader. Now that we have this, let's go to Tailwind CSS website, and there we're going to see how to get started with Tailwind CSS. So if we go to installation, you will see that we have to include these three things into main CSS file that we already have. We are going to essentially use these inside. We're going to go to our source styles index.css, and here we are just going to import all of these files. And once they are imported, then I can essentially go ahead and apply these styles. So let's save this. Now, since we have imported this, that would mean that we should be able to see all of this working, right? Now that we have imported this, that's not the end of the story. We also need to create a file or a configuration file for Tailwind, and we do that by using npx tailwind CSS init. So let's quickly do that. So I'm going to run this command from the project root, and this should essentially generate this Tailwind config for us. Now this looks fine, but I'm going to just update this configuration a bit to introduce two different colors like purple and light gray that we can test out in our project just to make sure that the Tailwind configuration is also working fine. So just to check our loaders, they are working fine. And now if I run npm start, let's see if we are able to check anything inside our CSS and HTML files. So I'm going to just quickly refresh. You can see that we have this background is still being applied. But if I try to go to index.html and say, hey, this header itself, let's say we're going to give this a class and say text white, which is essentially a class from Tailwind. So this would make the color white and it should reflect in the UI. So if I refresh now, you can see that nothing is being applied here. We do have the text white here, but you can see that this is not being applied. However, if I give this h1 a particular class, or even if I go inside our index.css and here if I use h1 and if I use something like apply and I say text white, would that make it work? You can see that here we compile this again. If I refresh now, you see it's not working. And the reason for that is we cannot apply any of the styles unless and until we have a post CSS config.js. So we need to create a post css.config.js, and inside here we need to define how we want to use this post config CSS, because we need to make this part of the bundler to involve CSS or Tailwind CSS. And we can do that by just this 4 lines of code, which essentially requires Tailwind CSS. We define the plugins of post CSS preset env, and we include Tailwind CSS. And now if we run this should be working to some extent, and we're going to see what extent that is. So now if I try to refresh, first you will see that the font automatically changed because now it's not exactly the same. However, the text white is not working. So we do have some of the styles coming from Tailwind CSS now, at least the ones that we imported in the index.css. But the thing is that we still don't have this text white being applied. Why? I don't know. Or maybe I know, but you don't know. So here, if I go again with, let's say, h1 approach, and if I go here and say, hey, the h1 is gonna have text white. Now we are applying the same sort of class of Tailwind class, but using CSS instead of HTML. If I do this, see this working. So that means that right now, everything works if I apply it from the CSS, but it doesn't work if I apply anything directly to the HTML. So if I remove this, the styles are going to go away, although I have the same class being applied here. So how do we make it work for the HTML? For the HTML, we need to go to our Tailwind config.js, and inside here, we need to define a property called purge. And this purge should point to our HTML files and our TS or JavaScript files. This makes sure that Tailwind is taking into account those files and is looking for those classes so it can generate the styles on the way. Now, if I go back, you see all of this is working. So what can I do more here? Maybe I can go to our index.html and change the background of it. So maybe do BG, yellow, and 300. If I do this, and you see, it changes it right away. So our Tailwind CSS is perfectly working fine. So I can maybe add a padding to it. It will also add the padding to it. and it looks good to some extent, to some eyes. But here you go. We have a whole setup in which if we save anything in the HTML, our dev server reloads. If we change anything in the CSS, our dev server also recompiles. And if we change anything into our JavaScript file or any of our TypeScript file, we also would be able to see this compile and also to be run. And now you see that we are getting the alert as well. And there you go. You have a really simple TypeScript plus Webpack Tailwind CSS project that you can use, without any other frameworks. If there's a really small project that you want to work on, or if you are like me who creates project to teach JavaScript to other people, but also wants the flavor of TypeScript and Tailwind CSS as we go forward. So if you find this video useful, make sure to share it with your friends. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I stream every Wednesday and Friday on multiple platforms: YouTube, Twitch, Facebook. Feel free to join anywhere. And as always, happy coding. And I'm going to see you in the next video.